The night of a billion systems did not fall at once. It unraveled, thread by thread, as if the cosmos were forgetting the craft of light. Stars guttered like exhausted watchfires, and the coal between them became an archive of vows, whispered and broken. The fortresses that once disciplined the spiral arms drifted as husks, their bastions gnawed by the patient teeth of vacuum, their banners wrung to colourless rope. Above Helliant Ridge, the auroras had a bruised tint, a false dawn that promised nothing, and the miles-wide sigils carved into the plateau meant to terrify enemies now looked like scars left by a surgeon who had lost his faith. It was the hour when the old empire remembered it had bones, and those bones ached. We have wandered long, you and I, between the ruins of certainties. We truly love and care for you, traveller of distant midnights, and would seat you by our fire if the void allowed it. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Helliant Ridge had not fallen exactly. Rather, it had continued, which felt worse. Continuance is an art that makes martyrs of stewards and relics of victories, and I had been both so often that the meanings frayed. I stood upon the western parapets, a silhouette with too many centuries folded into its posture, and listened to the failing wind scrape a music from the bones of crashed ships half buried in the Dune Sea. My title was Imperishable Regent, because nothing else had survived. My name was once a banner, and then a curse, and now it is a tool. I am the last steward of a legacy built upon geometry, granite, and obedience, and my immortality is not the quiet favour of gods, but the arithmetic of old biothaumaturges who wrote equations into marrow. I have outlived the men who forged me and the ages that needed me. Eternity teaches feral lessons. That stone forgets its quarrier, that iron remembers its first fracture, that a vow sung too often becomes a language no longer understood by the mouth that shapes it. I have died 44 times and returned 44 and 1, and with each return something fails to disembark with me. After my 9th death, I lost the faces of my tutors. After my 12th, the taste of bread. After my 31st, the certainty that my brother's laugh had ever been kind. The engineers insist resurrection is a ladder by which any fallen can climb. They neglect to say each rung is greased with a memory we will not feel missing until we reach for it in the dark. The war that broke our maps happened long ago and continues now in the grammar of scarcity. The meridian schism took the outer belts and cut our arteries with surgical joy, and in the corridors of that joy, my brother learned to be a sovereign. He is the wound I cannot cauterize, the axis around which betrayal still turns. Once we drilled together beneath banners the colour of sunlit bone, measuring the orbit of duty with the compasses of our father's doctrine. He liked to cut the air with his hand when he laughed, as though editing the world to his preferred shape. I mistook that gesture for joy, not the rehearsal of treason. When the Meridian War cracked our dominion, he did not break, he unfolded. They call him Sovereign of the Meridian Sun now, and his empire is a mirror held to my face at an angle that makes a stranger. The courtyards here are emptied of festivals and filled with ration lines that feel like vigils. The Council of Custodians comes from storage as if sculpted from the darkness, bearing their functions like penances. Satria, keeper of vows, drowning in chains of oath iron until her breath sounds as if she carries the sea. Malchior, master of numbers, whose eyes are abachi that click when he blinks, and Ideus, the unretired, whose failure to die promoted him to grand advocate of prudence. They give counsel that wears two faces, and neither is mercy. prosecute the refugees to prove our borders still possess teeth, or welcome them to bait the meridian into overreach. I ask how many resurrections remain funded, and Malchior's eyelids become a calendar. I ask Satria whether there is a clause in the Oath of Stone for forgiving a brother who made the galaxy more dangerous to save it, and her chains answer with a sound like rain on a mausoleum roof. Idaeus asks me whether the empire I protect exists outside my habit of protecting. He never waits for my reply. Word arrives carried by a courier in bone-white armor scored by micrometeors, bearing an icon I had ordered purged. He kneels with ceremonial precision that wobbles at the edges from exhaustion, removes his helm, and reveals the face of a man who has no more replacements. Lord Regent, he says, and the title sounds like both greeting and accusation. I bear an entreaty from the sovereign of the Meridian Sun. He does not say my brother's name, but the air forms it anyway. He offers a lumen slate sealed with an old cipher that opens at the heat of my palm. The message is not a letter but an invitation encoded as a cartographic riddle, a path drawn through dead systems toward a place called Kalmar's Wake. A meeting, it says, at the edge of a black nebula that eats navigational certainty, a corridor of truce provided by Meridian fleets, a promise of answers regarding the failsafe choir, and the reason resurrection now costs more than it gives. It is written in our private cant, a dialect we invented as boys to steal secrets from the adults who underestimated our ambition. Satria wants the courier interrogated until even his shadow confesses. Malchior wants to calculate outcomes until we starve on precision. Idaeus wants quiet. I want to ask my brother whether he remembers the boy who drew fortresses on the floor with chalk and called each square a citizen and each line a law. At night, the desert grows a crust of frost like armor that has slept in its duty too long, and the wind pulls thin music from the ribs of fallen hulls. I walk the ramparts and count the city's strata. The first ring cut from mountain spines when our empire was young. The deeper ring poured from slag when our crusades returned victorious. The deepest ring assembled from captured enemy bastions, a crown of conquered teeth. I have worn all three, and each tightens different. Beneath me, the refugee flotillas kindled the upper atmosphere with their friction, streaking like ash-tongued comets. Their signals beg sanctuary in a dozen grammars, and each grammar carries a legend of my brother as savior or butcher. I had believed loyalty a fortress. Now it is a mirror I must walk through. At dawn, I convene the council and bind them with a lighter chain. We will go to Kalmar's Wake with no more than a dozen, without banners or choirs, wearing the plain armor that lies. Satria protests with the ferocity of a saint denied her altar. Malchior murmurs that probabilities prefer cowards to heroes. Idaeus only nods and touches the scar that ended his retirement. I dismiss them, then stand alone in the observatory of orisons, where the lenses have cataracts, where the orreries tick like old grief. The engines hum in the docks like restrained thunder. In the glass, I see the man I am and the boy I was, and the weapon the empire built from their argument. Refugees wheel above us in fraying constellations. Somewhere a child is born at the exact moment a star goes out, and neither can be told what they owe us. I hold my brother's message in both hands as though warming them at a poor fire. Perhaps immortality's last cruelty is not the endlessness, but the way it makes every choice feel rehearsal when it is always premiere. I choose, and night listens. We launched at sundown, Palinode rising with monkish restraint, while the planet's shadow reached after us like a hand unwilling to let go. Her plate still bore names that would not stay erased. Starlight made the letters shine like bones. I took 12, Satria with oath chains, Malchior with Abachi eyes, Idaeus the unretired, and Real the Meridian courier, whose caution made his face a mask. Helliant Ridge dwindled from fortress to coin to thorn and was gone. A truce corridor unfolded ahead, beacons braided through dark. Meridian pickets floated at precise intervals, immaculate and indifferent. Each transponder whispered my brother's sigil. Riol sent the pass in our childhood cant. Hearing it from a stranger felt like discovering my handwriting on an ultimatum. A corridor becomes a noose, Satria murmured. Probability prefers the coward who arrives, Malchior said. Idaeus simply checked his knife and listened to the ship think. Kalmar's wake thickened on the dome, a black nebula weighing light. Derelicts hung at bad angles. Debris draped itself in slow arcs like broken rosaries. The wake breathed without sound. The Sovereign asks that the meeting be unrecorded and unharmed, Rial said. Assurance doubles as threat, Satria replied. The rendezvous proved a ruptured ring station. We docked along a surviving spoke and entered in plain armor, filters rasping, Satria's chains like rain. The corridors smelled of old oil and older dust. A child's handprint ghosted a bulkhead at a height that demanded hope. Idaeus paused, then moved on as if carrying it for the absent hand. The observatory crowned the station, windowed upon the wake. A wooden table waited with 2 cups cut from crater glass. My brother stood opposite in meridian gold, helm cradled, smile drafted rather than worn. Time had added lines and subtracted hesitations. You kept the cant, he said. You kept the world, I answered. We did not embrace. Satria advanced. Malchior hovered near the door. Idaeus chose the place where disaster would begin. Riol stood between loyalties like a suture. I called you into a grave, my brother said. Speak the truth that counsels dilute, I answered. The fail-safe choir fails. He did not argue. Our returns cut grooves into the lattice, he said. The lattice eats the living to feed the dead. Each resurrection leaves less man, more hunger. Satria's chain stilled. Malchior's eyes stopped clicking. Idaeus looked at the dark as if it had finally spoken his name. Why here? I asked. Because the key lies beneath that shroud, he said, gesturing to the wake. A leaving people planted a regulator there. Governor against recursion. Break it, and the choir goes silent, and our empire learns to die. Turn it the other way, and immortality becomes perfect. The living become spectators to our endless reprise. 2 betrayals, Idaeus said. Choose the one with a proper silence at the end. I ask you to betray with me, my brother said. I refuse to cure the galaxy alone. You always preferred partnerships delivered as fate, I told him. I learned that from you. The wake rippled. The station creaked like a chapel under pilgrims. Rial opened a small case and showed a device like a sleeping star. My brother cut his palm and fed it. The star woke in rose fire. It heeds only blood that knows our cant, he said, and offered the knife with the gentleness of sentence. I took it. Satria touched my elbow. Your oaths will not survive, she warned. Oaths survive us, or they are not oaths, I answered. Malchior whispered sums that predicted losses but not grief. Idaeus said nothing, which is what courage becomes at the end of argument. I cut my palm and let blood find the star. The dome coloured like false dawn. The wake folded to reveal a corridor inside the dark, a throat into machinery. There will be guards, Satria said. There will be witnesses, my brother corrected. If we end the choir, Someone must testify that we chose an ending, not a failure. I remembered the boy who drew fortresses in chalk and filled them with citizens he never expected to meet. Walls had hardened around him until he called them duty. We moved. Meridian escorts remained at ritual distance. Palinode ticked in the docks like a patient hound. The shaft smelled of cold iron and unused vows. At a halt, I signed passage for refugees clustered in a maintenance gallery. The truce promised nothing, but I could not add cruelty to math. Riol took their names as if the universe would ask him later. The last hatch opened onto a bridge arcing over the wake. The regulator waited ahead. Vanes and prayer wheels turning without wind. I felt its silence more than heard it. My brother walked beside me, close enough that I could have counted the scars on his knuckles. We began as children, he said. Measured against this, we remain so. Do you want forgiveness? I asked. No, I want witness. I lifted the waking star. The veins aligned like birds choosing south. Codes in our cant unfurled, simple as games, sovereign as funerals. I thought of the refugees dim in the gallery, of Satria's unbowed shoulders, of Malchior's uneasy arithmetic, of Idaeus and the scar that kept time on his face. I thought of the chorus humming behind all things like a mother who will not admit her child is gone. If I turn it off, I said, we become mortal, and the empire breaks along its honest seams. If you feed it, my brother said, we devour our children to preserve our reflections. The machine waited. The wake breathed. I pressed the star against the socket shaped like our blood, and felt the universe lean closer to hear which betrayal I would choose. Behind us, Satria's chains answered with a single note. Malchior's lids clicked once, and Idaeus unclenched his hand. Riol whispered the names he had written. The star turned, and everything we had been strained toward a single, breakable syllable turned the star toward silence. It seated with a swallowed chime, and the regulator forgot its hymn. Sound drained from the ring until footfalls felt blasphemous. The wake thickened into weight rather than colour, a pressure behind the eyes. The choir died like lanterns down a valley road, each a little sun surrendering to wind. In that falling, the arithmetic inside my bones slackened, a tension I had mistaken for virtue easing into ache. Satria lowered her chains and stood very straight. Malchior's eyelids clicked once, then learned humility. Idaeus exhaled, as if setting down an anvil he had carried through 3 wars and a retirement that never convinced him. Riol pressed his palm to the deck and listened to a silence he had been bred to fear. Somewhere behind us a woman cried out, and another voice answered by being born, a squall that felt like mathematics corrected. It is done, my brother said. His voice held neither victory nor plea, only witness. Not yet, I answered, and watched the veins of the regulator slow from prayer to posture. Kalmar's wake breathed once, a tide going out. Dust unseated itself from corners that had forgot light. A single snow of frost shook free along the bridge cables and vanished like a vow discharged. Messages stitched themselves across our private channels. Choir collapse detected. Resurrections stuttering. Governors demanding exceptions from a law older than their thrones. We should leave before the corridor closes its throat, Idaeus said. Probability recommends departure wrapped in apology, Malchior murmured. Oaths do not apologize, Satria said, but they do bow to consequences. My brother watched me, the old tilt of his head measuring my refusal to be measured. The Meridian will not honor this meeting tomorrow, he said. Today is already becoming myth. Then we must travel as if stories can kill, I replied. We moved as 12 do when every step is a verdict. The station shed a century with each corridor we crossed. Refugees clustered in hatch alcoves, their eyes like ports unshuttered for the first storm. I issued transit writs with the authority of a world that may not outlive the ink. Riol translated my promises into Meridian grammar without sanding their edges. At the spoke our escorts waited immaculate and unamused. Palinode trembled in her clamps like a hound that has remembered the hunt. A final beam from the dock cut the air between my brother and me. "This is the last clear road I can give you," he said. "Roads clear themselves when feet learn to choose," I answered. "Forgiveness has no artillery," he said. "Artillery has no memory," I said, and did not add that I had too much of both. He inclined his head, the gesture we had used as boys when a duel ended without victory. We sealed the hatch. Palinode backed from the ring, engines humming the old psalms in a lower key. The truce beacons blinked, confused, then paled. Beyond them, scavenger militias assembled like bad weather. Cutters with welded armour, a customs sloop painted with saints, a barge that once hauled ice and now ferried rumour. They hailed us with demands braided as prayers. Riol answered, his caution wearing our cant like a borrowed cloak. "We carry families and the first day of a harder calendar," I told the open channel. "If you must board, bring bread." Silence met the jest, and then, unexpectedly, laughter, as if an audience had discovered itself. They escorted us rather than hunted us. In the bridge's dim, Satria ungloved and took my wounded hand, turning the cut toward her breath. "Oathfather," she said, the title stripped of ceremony. "I have guarded promissories tall as cities. Today I saw one small enough to hold." "Keep it," I said. Malchior spoke without turning. "Arithmetic approves. Immortality defers bankruptcy. Mortality pays the bill." Idaeus smiled in the manner of men who keep their knives to remember their gentleness. "Bills make honest men of empires," he said. I walked the spine and read the ship the way a priest reads a text he no longer believes, but will, not betray. The erased names on the engine plaque rose in the angled light, mine among them, my brother's erased beside it, both scratches by an apprentice who thought war was a school. A message waited in my quarters, not from him. Sable glass lettering, an old sigil I had prescribed, the oblique conclave, that polite syndicate of undertakers who sold futures. "Your choir is ending," it said. "Sell us your dead while they are still cheap. We will lease them back as legends." I deleted it, and the deletion felt like rinsing ash from the mouth. Sleep visited the crew in thin veils. I stood at the observation blister and watched the wake recede, a bruise healing toward yellow. Riol arrived and hovered like bad news that had chosen manners. "Sovereign says the meridian will come with teeth," he said. "Empires always arrive with the part they trust," I answered. "Do you trust me?" I thought of his careful diction, of the way he had held the names of the refugees as if they were embers. "I trust what you feed," I said. "Keep feeding that." We fell into the ridge's long gravity with holds full and fuel honest. The auroras had learned new colours overnight, bruises thrown by choir nodes dying in distant hemispheres. The city throbbed as though remembering it had blood. We docked into the fortress throat. Air bit like early winter. Crowds gathered not to celebrate but to inventory us with their eyes. Somewhere a bell found its note. The council came up from storage, the three who were most themselves in crises that simplified calendars. Satria's chain spoke before she did. Malchior's lids ticked a sober metronome. Idaeus carried his retirement wound the way others carry medals. You chose, Satria said. He chose, Malchior corrected gently, meaning the universe. Now we count, Idaeus added. I told them what had been done at Kalmar's wake and what had not been promised in return. I told them the meridian would come dressed as certainty, and we must greet it as weather, not doctrine. The choir's end will bring a famine of ghosts, Malchior said. There will be markets. Close the markets, Satria said. Markets close only when hunger ends, Idaeus said. Then we will teach hunger to read, I said, and the joke landed like an oath. Night poured over Heliant Ridge and did not deepen, it clarified. The desert frost returned, silvering armor and rail, and from the lower tiers came the sound of an infant insisting upon existence. In the observatory, alone, I opened the viewport and let the coal climb in until breath smoked like old incense. I set my blooded glove beside the chime star and waited for the regret that resurrection once would have edited away. It did not arrive. In its place came a map, unrolling in my mind the way a scar remembers the knife. Meridian vectors arcing like thrown spears, refugee routes braided with our supply lines, a meeting ground where diplomacy could be mistaken for reprisal and thus be allowed to live. I sent orders with the restraint of a man who had once confused volume with authority. We would fortify less and feed more. We would permit grief to congregate under roofs. We would open the armories to craftsmen and let them turn weapons into tools until the meridian forced us to reverse the sacrament. When I finally slept, it was in a chair by a dead consul. Palinode's slow heart underfoot, the city's breath in the hull. I dreamed a chalk floor and a boy drawing squares he called citizens and lines he called law. My brother stood at the door, not entering, not departing, merciful in the way only distance can be. I woke to sirens that were not panicked so much as punctual, and the meridian crossed our sky like a theorem. I stood on the balcony where empires test their fluency, flexed the hand that had bled our choice, and let the cold translate my breath. Signals braided, promises and threats rehearsing the old duet. Below, markets closed without orders. Above, Palinode held a note between prayer and defiance. Open the gates, I said, but keep the bridges thin. The suns climbed like verdicts, and between them hung the work we had chosen to love. Dawn bled across Heliant Ridge like a wound unwilling to close, thin light gathering on parapets where banners had long since been stripped away. The Meridian fleet hung at measured distance, a wall of geometry and menace, their signal lights pulsing like a heartbeat too steady to be human. The choir was gone, but consequence remained, and in that silence both ridge and meridian searched for the new rules of existence. The people lined the lower tiers, eyes hollow with sleeplessness, carrying the weight of centuries now denied resurrection. Death had been returned to them as inheritance, and they studied it like novices uncertain whether it was punishment or gift. In the council chamber, the air tasted of dust, as though the fortress exhaled memories it had hoarded. Satria's chains trailed behind her like accusations, and their sound filled the pauses my voice could not. Malchior hunched over slate and abacus, his eyes clattering probabilities of defeat and survival into the air like the wings of locusts. Idaeus leaned back with the exhaustion of a man who had prepared for one end and received another, as if cheated even in victory. Riol stood apart. Meridian Courier turned uneasy bridge, his silence carrying the weight of two masters and the certainty of being trusted by neither. They will come, Satria said, her words deliberate as hammer strikes. They must. Your brother cannot allow the death of the choir to pass unanswered. I studied her chains, each one forged from the metal of an oath sworn and fulfilled, and wondered how long before her wrists grew tired of carrying them. He cannot answer it without also admitting he called me to Kalmar's wake, I replied. His silence is as dangerous as his armies. Malchior blinked, numbers clicking. Probability insists upon blood, whether his or ours is the variable. Probability has no pulse, Idaeus growled. Only hunger. I left them arguing and walked the high corridors. The city below stirred, fires rekindling in kitchens and workshops, lives resuming as if mortality had always been their neighbour. A mother carried a child swaddled against the cold, the infant's cry piercing the air like a declaration that life had not surrendered. It struck me harder than any speech. In that small sound was defiance, the will to begin in a world where endings once seemed optional. I touched the railing, its stone scarred with centuries of war, and felt the empire under my palm as a body too weary for another resurrection. When the emissary came from Meridian, the air itself seemed to retreat from him. He entered without heraldry, a single figure in gold-trimmed armour dulled by starlight, helm held in crook of arm. His face was carved with careful neutrality, the expression of one who knows every word may detonate. He bowed not as servant, but as equal, and his voice rang with rehearsed courtesy. The sovereign of the Meridian Sun acknowledges your choice. He invites you to council, aboard the vessel Renascent Glory, to speak, not to war. Yet. His pause was deliberate, the word yet left to linger like a blade over the neck. The council stirred, voices rising in protest, but I raised a hand. We will go, I said, though my own heart beat the rhythm of unease. If we refuse, we invite his truth to be written without us. The renascent glory was vast, a cathedral of steel and silence, its halls lined with statues of warriors whose faces had been erased by age or intent. They stared eyeless into the future, guardians of a creed too brittle to bend. The sovereign awaited in a chamber ringed by lightless glass, a throne rising from the floor as if carved from the heart of the ship. He wore no helm, and his face bore the scars of years spent ruling with the cruelty of necessity. Yet in his eyes there lingered a trace of the brother I had once known, the boy who had drawn laws on floors of chalk and called them games. That trace wounded more than his armies ever could. You killed the choir, he said, without accusation, without admiration, as one might recite a casualty. You killed the illusion, I answered. Now we are men again, and men can bleed. His smile was thin, brittle. Empires do not survive as men. Empires require gods, or the imitation of them. You have cut us down to hunger and fear. I stepped closer, hearing Satria's chains stir behind me. Better hunger and fear than eternity without meaning. He shook his head, sorrow hidden inside disdain. You mistake meaning for mercy. Without immortality, we will consume ourselves faster than any enemy could. Death breeds desperation. Desperation breeds treason. Then let us be desperate together, I said. Let us learn. Again the price of life. And in paying it, recall what we once swore to protect. For the first time his mask faltered. His hand rose, as if to touch mine, as if to bridge the gulf carved by centuries of betrayal. But he stopped, fingers curling into a fist. You ask me to dismantle the Meridian Sun, he whispered. You ask me to admit our empire is a ghost that never lived. I ask you to live with me, I said. Not forever, just long enough to matter. The chamber hushed. Even the statues seemed to listen. Behind us, Ideas shifted with the impatience of a man who trusted action over words. Malchior's eyes clicked, measuring futures none of us would choose. Satria's chains trembled like a prayer denied. Riol's breath caught, torn between masters. My brother's gaze hardened again, the trace of youth extinguished. "You will not like my answer," he said. And then he leaned back upon his throne, distance renewed, mercy dismissed. "Prepare your people. If you would have them mortal, then let them learn how brief that gift can be." We were escorted out, the weight of his words pressing heavier than the ship's gravity. As Palinode carried us home, silence reigned among my companions. In the observatory, I watched Meridian ships align in war formations, their lights braiding themselves into patterns of inevitability. The empire of my brother would not forgive, and ours would not surrender. Mortality had returned, and with it came war. War not of endless resurrections, but of final deaths, where each loss would be irreplaceable, each name carved into stone rather than edited into memory. And in that certainty, I felt both terror and clarity. For the first time in centuries, the end meant something. Preparation became a liturgy the city could recite even in sleep, a choreography of ration chimes, forge sirens, and low instructions spoken without panic, as if calm itself were a weapon we had mislaid and just found again. We relearned breath, we relearned weight, how to lift it without believing resurrection would catch what slipped. In the lower tiers, smiths unbolted doors that had sulked shut through 3 ages of abundance and coaxed the old business of fire awake. Smoke rose like black script written against a sky that would not answer. Children braided wire into sling strings, while their fathers uncrated rivet guns and their mothers spread tar on split roofs with strokes that looked like mercy. The market clocks chimed not for coin but for bread and water. The bakers marked loaves with a nail cross, so a man who could not read still knew it was his turn. I walked among them and tried to learn again the weight of being watched by people who expected not miracles, but fairness. The fortress knew my gait. It had measured me since I was short enough to be mistaken for the shadow of a standard. It creaked with the small pride of a thing long misused and newly needed. Satria shadowed me with chains wrapped in leather too. Quiet their speaking, each link an answered oath, each answer a weight. "If Meridian strikes the waterworks first," she said, "we lose 3 districts to thirst, and thirst does not negotiate." Her gaze softened nothing. It clarified. I asked if she remembered the first vow she took. She surprised me by smiling, not with joy, but with exactness, to stop flinching. She turned that stubborn smile upon the wall, as if daring granite to blink. I have failed it often and broken it never. We paused above an atrium where once a resurrection choir had practiced harmonics on days too bright for funerals. Now children chalked hopscotch squares and called each jump a star. "They will ask for your certainty," she said. "Give them your honesty instead. Certainty breaks when stared at. Honesty grows callous." I nodded and did not promise. Malchior poured grain tallies and water rations until columns became rivers that ran the table's length, and his eyelids clicked a sober music as he computed. "If we feed first, we can fight later," he said. "If we fight first, we will spend bread as bandages." He set a pebble on the map where the river curled like a sleeping animal. "Open the plaza here. Place ovens under the guns. Let war watch us feed. Witness is a kind of artillery." I asked if arithmetic could stomach pity. He looked up, tired as ruin. "Only pity can stomach arithmetic." Idaeus took the young to the yards and taught them the grammar of distance. "A bow speaks in arcs," he told them. and an arc is a prayer that trusts gravity to finish what courage began. He fixed my stance, as he had in campaigns I no longer remembered cleanly, nudging an elbow, straightening a foot, trusting muscle where sermons would fail. A girl with oil on her forehead asked if heroes were real. He tightened her bracer and answered without scorn, "Heroes end. That is why their names are worth the ink." Raol moved through alleys like a man crossing a courtroom that might call him to testify against himself. Refugees traced his passage with wary eyes, recognizing a meridian cut even beneath a patched cloak. By night he brought me names as if they were currency he could spend to keep belonging. Widows who wanted work at the ovens, a boy who could read dying star charts, a blind mechanic whose hands remembered every thread pitch in the armories. "They do not trust me," he said. "Good," I answered. "Trust is a ration." He searched my face. "What do you trust me to be?" "Hungry," I said, "for the right thing." He nodded, as if hunger were a discipline like any other. At dusk, the first test came, not as fleet or proclamation, but as rumour with a blade under its tongue. Shrines in the river quarter woke to find their icons turned to mirrors. Faces saw only themselves where saints had been. A voice on the public band spoke in my brother's mild cadence, promising safety to any who opened the water gate and walked, out singing the Meridian anthem. The tune was a conscript's lullaby. It could seduce a tired man toward the nearest simple story. Half the district did not know the words. Those who did remembered to be afraid of easy music. Satria sent oath keepers door to door with bread and buckets. The anthem braided with a slap of dough on stone and lost its appetite. The Meridian envoy wrote again, this time sweeter, as if dipped in grief. It asked for the bones of Meridian soldiers buried in our ossuaries from wars when we still traded prisoners after battles. So they may rest beneath their own sons, it said. Malchior calculated the export of grief. Satria weighed insult against mercy. Idaeus said nothing until I asked. "Burying a man is how you learn his name," he said. "Send half, keep half. Let both sides be unhappy enough to think." We sent coffins out under white cloth and kept the ledger of names open on the plaza, where anyone could read them aloud. Night thickened, and the oblique conclave returned, polite as ever. "Sell us your memorials," their agent urged, voice like velvet that had been poured too long. "We will guarantee remembrance." I told him forever had been cancelled. He smiled the way a knife glints. "Then lease us the years you still own." I gave him hard bread and a list of the unburied. He bowed as if I had paid him in coin and left with nothing that could be pawned. I slept at last, a narrow sleep tasting of stone. In the dream, the chalk floor waited. My brother drew a circle that refused to close. "You killed the choir to save me from myself," he said, "or to watch me fail." "Both," I answered, "and neither." He laughed, a door unlatched. "We are our father's sons. We think doors can be designed." Dawn woke me like a reprimand. The meridian formation had shifted closer, the geometry of debate hardening toward verdict. We gathered on the western balcony where the desert keeps its counsel. Scouts reported landers in the salt flats to the north. Men with survey frames and too many guards. Not invasion, insinuation. "They draw the lines they will later swear were always there," Malchior said. "Then we will draw ours where theirs cannot see," Idaeus replied, and led the young into the flats with dye bottles and a crate of broken glass to make the dust announce footsteps before boots arrived. Satria watched them go with a face I could not read and laid a chain across the rail like a benediction. By noon, A thin rain taught dust to remember mud. Under it, the city found a rhythm that belonged to no banner, only to famine and harvest and the patience between. We open armories not to spew weapons, but to spill tools. Welders, tampers, seed drills magnetized to bite shallow soil where roofs had been. Men and women carried them away with hands not yet steady. Steadiness found them. A child skipped past counting to 12. I realized there had been 12 of us at Kalmar's wake, and felt the number sit in my chest like a small, sharp truth. In the observatory, the lenses had been cleaned, cataracts rubbed from glass by volunteers who believed in small redemption. I stared at the meridian mosaic and spoke to a face I could not see. Empires do not survive as men, I whispered, but men may survive empires. The room answered with the ship's slow pulse. At twilight, a bell struck 9, then 5, then 9 again, our code for strangers at the outer farms. A caravan arrived out of the burnt east, bearing salt, dried skystem leaves, and stories distilled past truth. Their leader wore a necklace of mechanical keys from machines no one owned anymore. "We heard your death has been returned to you," she said. "We came to see how you wear it." "Poorly," I said, "but fitting improves with use." She smiled without charity and asked sanctuary. We gave it and asked for stories in return, because stories are a kind of map. When night took the last color from the sky, the meridians spoke not in honeyed letters, but in the broad, dry voice of their main array. "Prepare to receive correction," Palinode rumbled, a hound who knows that knock. Satria's chains remembered their full weight. Malchior's lids clicked a prayer. Idaeus tightened the strap on his knife. Ryle stood beside me as if he had chosen a side and discovered it much larger than he could carry. I tasted the word they had chosen, felt it try to occupy my mouth like a foreign rank. Correction. I looked over the city that had chosen to breathe without permission, and felt, for the first time in lifetimes, the precise outline of fear that does not bargain. "Open the ovens," I said. "Light the signal pits. Keep the bridges thin." The suns had long set, but another kind of dawn drew breath in the streets as men and women took their places not only to fight, but to be seen refusing. Above us, the meridian hardened into angles. Below, Heliant Ridge learned how to stand without immortality, which is to say, with meaning. The first meridian landers touched down at dawn, iron beetles unfolding their legs into the salt flats with a precision that felt more ritual than military. Their banners did not unfurl. They remained wound around poles, as if secrecy itself were an emblem. From the parapets of Heliant Ridge, we watched their silhouettes arrange themselves into grids, a geometry meant to remind us of inevitability. Smoke from the ovens drifted between us and them, thick with the smell of bread, a defiance that had no armor but stubbornness. The people of the city gathered at the plazas, not to celebrate nor to wail, but to stand where they might be counted, as if their presence alone was shield enough. Mortality had returned, and they meant to wear it without disguise. I stood on the high balcony, Satria at my side, her chains wrapped tighter so their weight bruised her skin. "They want us to break first," she said. "They will offer mercy as if it were food, and then measure how many starved themselves to taste it." Her eyes found mine, steady as stone. "What will you refuse?" I thought of Kalmar's wake, of the choice that had stripped eternity from our marrow, and answered her honestly. "I will refuse to regret what has been done. Regret is another kind of leash." She inclined her head, and for once the chains made no sound. By midday the meridian sent their heralds, 3 figures in pale armor, faces veiled, carrying empty bowls. They stopped at the edge of the flats, where the dust cracked into ridges. The bowls gleamed like moons. Malchior muttered probabilities under his breath, his eyelids clicking. 3 bowls means truce or ultimatum. The weight of grain they bring will decide. Idaeus spat into the dust. Then let's see how light their mercy weighs. The heralds set the bowls down and retreated, wordless. From the walls, we saw each vessel held not grain, but mirrors, polished to brilliance, reflecting our fortress back upon itself, an offer, a threat, a reminder. We would feed only on our own image. The crowd below murmured like a tide, uneasy. I raised my hand. Take them, I ordered. But do not smash them. Let them sit in our plazas. Let every man and woman see themselves reflected and learn the taste of being seen. The murmurs broke into nervous laughter. Fear learned to breathe differently. That night, Meridian ships moved into the sky above us, their formations a lattice that swallowed stars. Riol stood beside me at the observatory, cloak drawn close. He will not strike yet, he said. He wants you to beg, so he can say he was merciful. And you, I asked, what do you want? He hesitated. To belong somewhere where begging is not the language. His face looked younger in the starlight, though I knew it carried decades of exile. Then you belong here, I said, though I could not be certain the words were true. He accepted them anyway, as if sometimes belonging was not proof, but practice. On the second day, fires sprang up in the southern quarter, started not by bombardment, but by hands within. Riol's voice tightened as he identified the accent of the slogans painted on walls. Meridian sympathizers, offering themselves as footholds. Satria led oath keepers into the alleys, not with blades but with buckets and bread. They doused the fires, handed loaves to the rioters, and stood unarmed until the shouting burned itself to ash. When one man asked her if she was not afraid, she lifted her chains and said, "Fear is heavy. Carry it long enough, and you forget your hands are empty." By evening, the quarter was quiet. Not loyal, not treacherous, just tired. Sometimes that was enough. In the council chamber, Malchior presented figures that bent under their own sorrow. We can last 6 weeks without the outer farms, 3 if Meridian severs the wells, longer if we eat less, fight less, expect less. He blinked twice, the sound sharp as breaking twigs. Idaeus slammed his knife into the table. Expect less. I taught them to aim for the throat, not the knees. Then teach them again, I said. But this time, make them aim for meaning. He looked at me with the fury of a soldier who knows battles are not always won with blades. Meaning doesn't bleed. No, I answered softly, but men do, and that is why it matters. On the third night, I dreamed again of chalk floors. My brother drew a fortress with no gates. Correction, he said, echoing the Meridian's voice. That is what they call it. Correction is not destruction. It is alignment. I touched the chalk wall, felt its smoothness. Correction without choice is only erasure. He laughed, the sound bitter as metal on teeth. You've always thought choice was holy. Perhaps it is only decoration. I woke before dawn, heart tight, and wondered whether he spoke from memory or from the shadow of what was coming. At dawn, the Meridian fleet shifted, their ships opening like flowers of iron. Lances of light cut the desert, not striking us but circling, sketching a cage. From the plazas below came no panic. Instead, the people lit their signal pits, flames clawing skyward, red as new blood. From above, the ridge must have looked like a constellation inventing itself. I heard a child laugh in the street, high and wild, and and for the first time in centuries, the sound broke me. Mortality was here, and in its arrival, there was a savage kind of beauty. Satria came to me then, chains unwound, her wrists raw. "They will come tomorrow," she said. "Not today, tomorrow." I asked her how she knew. She smiled faintly. "Because even gods need sleep, and tomorrow they will wake hungry." Her certainty was cold as stone, and I believed her. I turned back to the desert where Meridian's banners now unfurled, pale silk catching the new sun. Correction was coming. War was no longer postponed. The ridge had one more night to breathe, one more night to remember that endings were gifts denied to us for too long. And then the morning would arrive with fire. Morning arrived with an obedience that felt like contempt, a pale ribbon drawn across the parapets, while Meridian banners shook themselves awake, and the grids in the salt flats glittered with the cold intention of instruments that believed themselves neutral, and our ovens coughed, our signal pits breathed, and the city rehearsed the small sounds by which mortals begin to live even as war lifts its foot. I walked the western balcony with Satria beside me, her chains wrapped to bruise their speaking, and below us the plazas filled not with panic but with presence. Men and women standing where they might be counted. Children holding bowls that would be used for porridge or rain, depending on which gods answered, while Palinode hunched in her cradle like a patient hound, and the Meridian fleet adjusted its geometry one careful click at a time, a constellation pretending to be law, until the first salvo wrote a thesis across the dunes and unrolled a seam of glass as though the desert were being polished for a funeral we were expected to admire. We did not answer, not until the second lance folded a watchtower-like paper and threw its shadow upon a bread line, and then Palinode spoke with a measured voice, her guns writing the counter-argument in brief, clean strokes that refused to drown us in heroism, and dust rose, and the city ducked and did not cower, and Idaeus, who had kept the bridges over the dry canal as narrow as prayers, placed the young along their rails and corrected stances with 2 fingers and a word, while Malchior's lids clicked in restrained panic through the whisper pipe, as he told me the wells would be targeted in 2 minutes because thirst would plead the case that mercy rehearses, and I sealed the sluices and opened the rooftop cisterns and ordered bucket lines where alleys narrowed into discipline, and thirst arrived anyway, but it wore our badge, so bowls stayed smaller, jokes grew longer, and laughter learned to fit itself into the day's ration. Meridian infantry advanced beneath a veil of white smoke that smelled like rain, their banners unfurling late, pale cloth becoming scripture only at the instant of danger, and 3 squads attempted to shoulder the same bridge, and learned humility in the tangle, as arrows traced patient arcs and stones remembered older arithmetic, and Satria, chains shining like wet iron, stood upon the central span and recited the oath of stone until the smoke forgot why it was made, and a herald approached carrying a polished bowl in a grip, too careful to be generosity, and asked for parley in a voice tuned to the cadence of my brother, the syllables disciplined to resemble kindness, and I went to the midpoint with empty palms, and the herald said the word correction as if testing resonance, while I replied with history and grief, and he lifted his veil to reveal a face too young for certainty, and asked whether we would kneel to mathematics, and I told him we had cancelled immortality to remember the price of numbers, and that if his sovereign needed witnesses for decency, he could bring bread instead of mirrors, and I sent him back with a bowl unfilled, and soon drones arrived like dark birds and shed slips of paper that glowed with embedded lures, each printed with my brother's face, and an anthem that revealed itself when breathed upon, and children chased them until Satria gathered the slips into her arms and brought them to me, and I breathed and read, "Lay down your chains and receive allotment." And I smiled without charity and ordered the slips burned in the ovens so they might leaven something worth eating. By midday, meridian spears found the aquifers and turned water into confession, and our rooftop rain answered, and the people lifted bowls to a sky that briefly remembered mercy and real, meridian vowels cut by ridge, grit, organized the lines with a sergeant's refusal to accept delay, and a girl with oil on her brow asked if dying meant the same thing it used to. And Idaeus told her heroes end, and that is why their names are worth the ink. And then a lance broke the atelier beneath the eastern bastion, where clockmakers kept time for bells and harvests, and the strut sighed, and the floor tilted, and a quarter of the bastion slumped like a tired shoulder, and the workers came with faces blacked by dust, carrying the bell's tongue like a wounded child. And we crawled into the hot hollow and found the master wedged under an iron rib, and he told me to take the ledger because names must remain punctual even when towers forget. And we slid him free, and he died with the ledger unblotted, and I set it in the plaza, where anyone could read aloud and become part of the hour they named. Toward evening, a storm walked out of the flats. Not water, but dust turned intimate, so the world shrank into a corridor of close distances, and meridian lances lost their precision, and our streets remembered their old muscle, and bakeries became infirmaries, and awnings became doctrine. And Idaeus found 3 meridian squads in a collapsed colonnade and offered bread before surrender, and they accepted, ashamed of their hunger and of the kindness that answered it. And Malchior warned of power rationing, and I laughed more softly than fear deserved, and told him arithmetic would have to learn kindness or remain uneducated. And night fell with more gravity than usual, and the fleet above resolved into patient constellations, while the city creaked as wood does when it remembers being a tree, and the wounded learned to count without hope of revision. And Ryle joined me at the balcony and said the polite geometry was over, and that tomorrow my brother would bring the argument that does not listen. And I told him we must teach it ears, and he asked if I regretted Colmar's wake, and I answered that regret was a leash, and that I would not wear it, even if my throat offered comfort in the collar. And below us the meridian mirrors lay where we had set them, bright islands catching firelight and faces so people compared not to admire but to assemble, learning by reflection that a city is a crowded star. And at midnight Satria came with chains unbound, so the iron spoke its native tongue, and said engines were moving in the west, heavy ones made not for landing but for erasure. And I sent Idaeus to rig spans with choices instead of charges, and Malchior to wake the cisterns for steam, and I went alone to the observatory, where the orreries ticked like patient sins, and set my brother's folded likeness on the sill, and said aloud that empathy was a weapon he had never trusted. And when the second hour after midnight came, a tremor threaded the stone from heel to skull, and the dust inside the glass rose like breath, and from the salt flats a new shape lifted, a cathedral of engines draped in pale silk, floating without apology. And as its shadow touched the outer farms, the mirrors in our plazas vibrated, and the bread in the ovens fell. And a whisperer in the corridor said the Meridian had built a choir that did not sing, but that remembered how. And I understood too quickly that my brother had found a way to be a god again, and that tomorrow would not merely test our courage, but our decision. And I laid my hand flat upon the stone, and felt its old attention returning, and told the city, as one tells a friend at the edge of a cliff, to keep breathing, because morning would come again. and it would arrive with a voice. The engine cathedral drifted over the salt like a moon taught to disobey gravity. Veils of pale silk roped to pylons that hummed in a key the bones remembered, and when it found its station the sky went quiet, as if listening for a word older than weather, the first note arriving not by air but through stone, a pressure like grief before it learns its name. While window lead lines shivered, bread fell in pans, and the meridian mirrors tilted toward the thing the way starflowers turn toward light that never meant to be kind, and Real whispered, "He has built a remembrance organ," and Malchior added, "A recursion grid, key to funerary records." As Satria unbound her chains so their true metal could answer with a low rain that made the skin stand, a sound like discipline waking. The organ did not sing. It remembered singing, and the air thickened with echoes of our dead, not heard but known, the way a lover's name can ache inside the jaw, even when unspoken, and 100,000 unsaid names gathered at the lip of speech, and men dropped tools to turn toward plazas. Mothers tightened their grip on the living. Idaeus touched the scar that kept him promoted to survival, and said, "He means to make us nostalgic for obedience." And I, feeling treachery wake in my own chest, answered, "He means to make regret a garrison," knowing how longing can look like mercy when hunger is old, and from the fleet a beam extended like a pale umbilicus, along which a silk-draped litter came armoured in rhetoric, halting above our western canal while drones swarmed like midges over still water, and a herald's voice in my brother's rhythm, gentle, exact, unanswerable as a ledger, poured from them, saying, "People of the Ridge, you have been corrected to mortality by your regent. We offer remediation. Return your dead. We will house them in the organ until rights can be restored. Lay down the weight you cannot carry." And Satria looked at me with chains lying like tame serpents along her forearms and said, "If we refuse, they will take the names anyway." And Malchior said, "If we accept, we lease our grief. Debts come due." And I wanted, obscenely, to say yes, to rest the names that lacked roofs, to share the burden like cool water on a fever. And I closed my eyes on Colmar's wake, the regulator's veins slowing, the star in my palm, my brother's face between argument and plea, hearing again his witness, and wondered if he wanted me to witness compassion used as siege. "Answer them," Idaeus said, impatient with my silence, and I stepped to the rail, letting drones triangulate me into a target of attention, and said, "We remember without cages. If you ask for names, come in person and speak yours first." And the herald paused, then laughed without laughter, offering transports, allotments, amnesty for the tired, while drones dropped ceramic tokens stamped with my brother's sigil that rang bright on stone, promises hard enough to bruise, and Satria gathered them like weeds pretending to be useful, and the second note from the organ went deeper, tugging at marrow, refugees on terraces swaying not with surrender but recognition, moving as people do when old songs find them. And Ryle pressed his hands to his ears and whispered, "He's tuned it to our ossuary records. The dead are not speaking, their absences are being articulated." And Malchior's lids clicked fast, asking counter-resonance, and Idaeus said, "We have kettles, we can make the city boil." And Satria answered, "Steam will veil, but veils remember faces." While I turned the great wheel in the cleaned observatory lenses until the engine cathedral filled the glass, veins curled like drought leaves, ribs etched with scripture I had co-authored then outlawed, coffers hanging from its belly labelled with coordinates raided from our archives, and I understood he did not want our dead so much as our indexing. obedience to grief in a machine that could invoice mercy. "Open Vault 9, I said, tasting exile. And Satria's head jerked. Malchior froze as if the abacus inside him had held its breath. Idaeus swore without heat, and Real looked like a man brought to a cliff to learn Falling's pedagogy, because Vault 9 was not a weapon, but an unsong we had hammered together in an older famine of hope, meant to erase ritual signatures across a field so no liturgy could bind or beckon. A comb to rake the hair of the world until the tangles became baldness, crippling their organ and bruising everything else. And Malchior said, "We will lose our Bell Chronicles the way we name ours." And Satria added, gentler than iron, "We will lose the river's blessing rites." And Idaeus, surprised by his own throat, said, "We will lose prayers." And I, feeling like a man condemning a library to save a child from fire, said, "We will keep the living. Prepare it." The city learned what we intended the way cities always know, by shoulder angle and the odd quiet that falls upon markets when storms announce themselves in languages no one admits they speak. And I walked plazas touching stones, accepting cups of water, apologizing with my eyes until a woman stopped me and held up a faded ribbon, saying, "I tied this on my daughter's cot the day the choir returned her. It was a lie. Thank you for ending it." And tucked the ribbon into my glove like an entrusted promise I could not keep safe. And at the canal, Satria and Oath Keepers raised the device on welded poles like a bell that had forgotten how to ring, while Real read the interdiction sequence and flinched at the syllable that would erase Meridian catechisms as easily as ours, saying, "There will be no language left for surrender." And Idaeus answered, "Then our hands will speak," tightening his grip on the litter, and the organ swelled, mirrors trembled, bread wept in ovens, children reached for tokens because they shone, and I lifted the unsong's lever until it kissed release, the city holding breath like a diver at a dark river mouth, drones leaning nearer, hungry to record our undoing. And in the lenses, my brother's cathedral rotated a vein to reveal a figure standing in a niche under its heart, small as a windowed saint, having come in person not to speak but to be seen, and his presence punctured my certainty because he trusted the ghost he had made, and I had built a silence. And Satria said, "Do it." Voice steady, chains loose at her sides like rivers learning to lie down. And Malchior echoed, glasses cold as law, and Idaeus nodded once to accept blame or blessing, and Real looked at the children, and the organ's third note rose, the precise pitch of a true name being called across a battlefield, and I set my hand to the lever and pulled. The unsong went out like a blade hammered from absence, widening until breath stepped aside. Stone drank it, iron remembered refusing, and relics forgot the grammar that bound prayers to duty. Above the flats, the engine cathedral lurched as if noon surprised it with sleep and shame. Silk veils fell like rain-tired flags, veins stuttered, ribs knocked together like wintering teeth. The umbilicus of light guttered, flared, then died as our comb of silence raked the sky. People tilted their heads, listening for a name that would not arrive, then resumed with careful hands. Satria's chains answered with a slow rain. Malchior's lids clicked once and learned humility. Idaeus exhaled the anvil. Real pressed both palms to rail and let loyalty be quiet. Betrayal arrived dressed as hospice, a procession in white bearing bone arcs carved with practiced mercy. At their head walked Verity Cord, a quitted registrar with a smile like a closed book. Satria met her at the plaza's mirror, leather-wrapped iron and patience braided in her stance. The unsong made the mirror tremble like a shallow lake remembering winter's first hoofprint. Verity, I said, tasting courtrooms and stale incense in the syllables left behind. You sold turns in the choir. Now you rent forgiveness by the hour to the tired. She examined me as a locksmith studies hinges before choosing which to praise. I recorded need, she said. You recorded doctrine. You stripped mourning of words and called it virtue. Real murmured, Meridian 03, no liturgy by machine. Refuge, Verity answered, not compulsion. Satria's chains tightened like nerves. Idaeus's hand found the knife that had promoted him. Malchior whispered numbers predicting sorrow with professional detachment and honest fatigue. The mirror cracked like a heavy page torn free. Reflection had lost the language to bear itself. Shards fell like closing chapters. The crowd flinched and stood. Verity did not move at all. Witness needs architecture, she said. You demolished yours. Let us lend you ours for a price. Idaeus stepped. Satria's chain slid between them, a gentler verdict than steel would offer. Above, the organ's niche darkened. The small figure under its heart disappeared between breaths. Palinode wrote a measured line into dunes. Meridian artillery answered and bit our parapet. Runners departed with orders I had already shaped. Bread still cooled despite falling flat. A man kissed crust as apology to a god told to rest, and finally obeyed. I faced Verity at arm's length to spare us the indignity of calculation and theatre. Cross the canal and you will not return, I said, keeping mercy from my voice. Satria signalled. Oath keepers separated hospice and plaza with shoulders, palms, and practiced patience. Verity bowed, too low for contempt, too shallow for respect. Spectacles draw arrows, she warned. A meridian picket advanced to make prophecy credible. We answered with ovens and signal pits. We raised the shards so faces reflected in fragments that refused hierarchy or singular verdict. People studied themselves and one another until surprise softened into recognition and resolve. We had won nothing clean. Bells forgot their hours. Lullabies abandoned guarantees and easy rhymes. The river still moved, but blessing became hands, eyes, and the slow courage of buckets. A woman gave me a lock of hair. For forgetting, she said, and I held it like a weapon. Night came blunt, fires took stations. The unsong cooled, ticking like rain on a known roof. I set my brother's likeness on the observatory sill and let it refuse judgment. Hospice withdrew. Bonarchs left like chessmen abandoned by a bored and fasting god. The engine cathedral sagged, steadied, lowered by degrees with the patience of snowfall. The Vox declared dawn parley at the river gate. I slept as a sentry dozes holding a spear. At first light we went, Satria, Idaeus, Ryle, and I. Plain armour hiding titles turned into tasks. Mist lifted from the canal like a congregation undecided about doctrine and hymn. Meridian lines glimmered at ritual distance, polite and precise to the edge of mockery. He stood alone under a ruined fig, unhelmed, unguarded, winter weaponized at his temples. His hands told me he had counted my steps and would count my words as well. You preached against me with my own organ, he said, exact without anger or ornament. You came to Kalmar's wake to force this. Mourning, I answered. We are brothers still. He produced a sound that had been laughter once and now only organized silence. Then hear me as a brother, he said. The counter-song uses birth cries. No bruise, only kneeling. You can stop me only by making language suspect. Is that the world you desire? Satria's chains tightened. Idaeus's thumb found his promotion. Ryle watched my mouth for treason. I want a world that ends, I said, so that meaning can live without counterfeit crowns. He looked at my hands, then the water, and grief crossed his face, without armor or escort. I wanted a world that would not abandon me, he said. So I built one that could not leave. You broke it. Perhaps you were right. Perhaps you were merely tired of holding it. He lifted empty palms. Choose. Behind him, the organ's ribs relit like a confession learning words. A child cried. A dozen mothers hushed in the old cadence. I heard the weapon forming. I closed my eyes and weighed verity's warning against the lighter, crueler weight of hope. When I opened them, the mist had thinned, and the day had chosen clarity instead of pity. I choose hunger over leash, I said. I choose endings over rehearsal and over painted crowns. He nodded once, the childhood mark of jewel without victory, and turned back into geometry. In the plaza's bone arcs clicked like teeth remembering their first purpose and their last. A wind came from the flat smelling of old incense and new dust and untested vows. The city leaned toward me the way a tired friend leans when the road begins to rise. Keep the bridges thin, I said. Open the ovens. Prepare the mothers to sing without surrender. Satria bowed. Malchior's lids found their sober metronome. Idaeus smiled with the knife's humility. Real exhaled as men do after surface, water still loud inside their ears and ribs. The engine cathedral's shadow slid over the canal and touched my boots like a cold hand searching my pulse. The organ returned at noon with surgical precision, a silver thread through marrow that made the city inhale together, as if one invisible hand had trained us to become its instrument. Bowls pressed to chests, palms met stone, ovens steadied their red mouths, and I felt the pitchcomb scars I had advertised as medals, while it searched for the boy who drew laws in chalk. My brother had tuned the machine to what we loved before we learned to fear it. Satria stood beside me with wrists rubbed raw by iron, chains looped wide so their weight would not pull her stance. If this note holds, the bridges will bow, she said. If we answer only with iron, we confess we have no other language. Malchior's lids clicked a sober metronome. Idaeus squeezed the rail into honesty. Real stared at the engine cathedral with the longing of a man who has watched too many doors close. If he asked you to end this as brothers, would you go? I remembered Kalmar's wake and the taste of iron left in rain. This time I would not carry eternity home. The organ's second note was water-working stone, remembrance arriving like weather people call by family names. Knees bent in the river quarter, not in surrender, but in recognition. Satria leaned close and named our answer. Steam. We worked without drums. Malchior mapped heat as generals once mapped cavalry. Oath keepers hauled coils and kettles. Children dragged wood with the stubborn grace of people who know what fire is for. Bakers fed flames that would not feed us. Palinode gave spare water and shivered as if charity taxed hull and nerve. Real vanished into culverts to weld shut temptations our enemies would call roads. By midnight, a damp breath rose from the city, hesitant, then committed, unrolling from roofs in billows like infantry taught to kneel and fire on cadence. The organ's line wavered. Remorse lost confidence when answered by endurance. Hold, Satria whispered, and I believed the stones heard her. It would have worked without blood if betrayal had not learned our timetable. A mean detonation peeled open the river yards. Vortices drank the new clouds into mouths that did not exist. The billows shredded. The organ steadied with a patience that declined to gloat. Idaeus was running. Satria's chains cracked like dry lightning. A tooth went missing from the city's jaw. We found hospice veils in rebar, 6 ascetics folded like empty cases, and verity cord with hands shaped as prayer, veil grey as ash. Correction required aperture, she said. You refused purchase. We forged tithe. Satria struck. Gravity granted her petition. Verity fell like a curtain surrendering a stage. Bind her, I said. And Idaeus did, gently, because fury cannot be our only alphabet. Real listened at the hole as if stone still carried language. They built a resonance room under our feet, he said. A throat for the organ to borrow. We cannot cloud it. We must cut the engine itself. Satria shook her head. A boarding run beneath that shadow was a vow no one returned from. Men return from nothing, Idaeus said, until someone chooses to return. Malchior murmured the city's remaining water and heat in a sum that ended at morning. Without a cut, noon would belong to Meridian. I go, I said before prudence taught a slower courage. The sentence fit like certain pains do, because they have an outline. Satria lifted her chains to argue, then lowered them like a sacrament neither of us admired. Then 12, she said. Let the number remember us. We chose oath keepers, 2 welders, a midwife who refused to be kept from endings, Real, Idaeus, Satria, and I. Palinode climbed through our homemade weather like a hound slipping its leash into a storm. In the observatory, I tied a faded ribbon to the console, a small vow asking a larger to be kind. We launched low. Chimneys painted our hull with soot. The organ loomed, ribs unfurling, silk shedding like admonitions. I spoke to the city over short band, my voice smaller than the task. Keep bridges thin. Feed before you shoot. If you must die, do it near someone who will remember you with warmth rather than math. Breath answered. Ryle found a seam along the belly where coffers met structural mercy. Idaeus threw hooks like verdicts. Satria's chains became ladders. Oath keepers crossed with the slow solemnity of monks bearing wine. We cut a panel engraved with an ordinance I had written and later outlawed. Air sighed from the wound, incense that had forgotten its god. Inside sound behaved like weather. Robed figures mouthed rites that no longer worked since the unsong raked their grammar. Hands twitched, bereft of choreography. They are trying to remember how to be devout, Ryle whispered, and pity rose like an unwise volunteer. We entered the heart nave, a ring of consoles around a shaft, where dark tangled with light, the remembrance core pulsing like a library learning breath. He stood there, not enthroned but braced on the rail, the posture of a boy leaning over a chalk empire. You came, he said, voice that sought me, and not the machine. You brought the oath I feared and the knife I taught. I had prepared arguments and found only grief without grammar. Stop it, I said, not as regent but as kin. Let the year go home in days rather than throats. He touched the rail and the core gentled, a beast remembering its name. I tethered time, he said. If I unclasp it, the year will fall all at once. A year of deaths like weather, Idaeus breathed. Satria's chains trembled like distant rain. Malchior counted on the band and could not finish the sum. My brother looked at me down the corridor of our childhood. If I release it slowly, the meridian will keep faith. If I release it now, the meridian will break. If you cut the core, you will end both of us. The ribs creaked, the shaft sighed. The city flickered across glass in grainy breaths and stubborn tasks. I set my glove beside his hand, the ribbon bright as unwise hope. Endings are why names matter, I said. Give it back and let us remember it honestly. He closed his eyes as if our father's balcony had just cooled. When they opened, They were not cruel and not forgiving, only tired of crowns. We braced together. My brother unclasped time. The organ drew breath to scream. I cut the power. The scream never arrived. Instead, the organ released a wind that smelled of extinguished altars, a pressure that pressed the teeth and then withdrew, as if ashamed of its appetite. The ribs stuttered, silk sagged, and the remembrance core guttered like an ember denied a bellows. Lights along the consoles died one by one, until only our breathing inventoried the room. Gravity remembered its work. The cathedral listed, and dust unstitched from old prayers to hang in the shaft like tired constellations. My brother kept his hands on the rail, not kingly, only steady, the posture of a craftsman refusing to lie about the work. So now it ends honestly, he said, and the admission made the dark gentler. Satria's chains rang once in agreement, then fell quiet, as if iron feared to counsel. Idaeus anchored the ladder with his knife. Ryle mapped routes in whispers, marking doors that wanted to be exits and doors that wanted to be verdicts. Come, I told my brother, and reached. He did not move. If I leave, Meridian will learn the wrong lesson. They must see me hold until it breaks. He pressed something small into my glove, a shard of glass etched with a child's compass. Use it when you must be poor and accurate, he said, the old mischief passing like a faint star. The floor lurched, the core surged a last reluctant light. In it I saw not saints but ledgers, not hymns but receipts for unwept sorrow. We crossed the nave as acolytes staggered, their mouths forming rituals that had lost their grammar. Pity walked beside us and did not choose our step. At the wound we had cut, Palinode's hooks bit true. Steam from the city drifted up in hesitant veils, a weather of our making. We climbed, chains as ladders, hands as oaths. Below, the organ settled toward silence the way a winter animal settles into hunger. Halfway out, I looked back. He had turned from the rail to the core, bareheaded. No silhouette meant for legend. Only a man tasked with ending his own invention. Witness, he said, without looking up, the word as small and heavy as a nail. I nodded, a gesture he could not see, and let Idaeus drag me into the daylight. Outside, meridian geometry faltered. Some ships steadied for a shot that never came. Others drifted as if listening to their own engines decide. The engine cathedral shed silk like weathered skin and began to sink, dignified as a courthouse closing for the last time. In the streets, the mirrors lay in shards. People moved among them carefully, choosing which angles to keep. Bells rang the wrong hours and were forgiven. Bakers knocked flat loaves from pans with the mercy of hands that had learned not to promise. Satria touched my shoulder as Palinode shouldered free of the organ's shadow. You could have dragged him. He did not ask to be saved, I said, and the answer tasted like law. Ryle watched the fleet with the patience of a man teaching himself to breathe in a new climate. They will call this treason against hope, he said. Then we must teach them a different hope, I answered, and the words felt both weapon and wound. We made birth on the western cradle to a city holding its breath. Smoke braided with dawn as if the sky were learning to breathe with us, not over us, and the refugees who had no hymns left raised their hands the way sailors read wind, measuring what remained by touch and by each other in the failing light. The plaza filled with faces that expected neither miracle nor apology, only a sentence that could be lived with. Idaeus set Verity Cord at my feet, bound and breathing. She met my gaze with the registrar's refusal to flinch. What will you write for today? She asked. I looked at the ribbon knotted to my glove. then past the smoke to the lowering bulk, where my brother's silhouette diminished to function and then to rumour. "The truth," I said, though truth is the ugliest coin. Above us, the cathedral groaned and settled. Below us, the wells ticked and held. Between those sounds stretched the narrow bridge we had chosen, endings that might teach mercy, and mercy that might learn to end. The cathedral settled into the flats like a verdict cooling, and the fleet above froze in the uneasy posture of swords that had forgotten which way was forward. In the plaza, the people waited with bowls and breath, listening for the sound of a future that might finally belong to them. Satria set Veritycord on her knees beside the broken mirror and unwrapped her chains, as if removing a bandage from a stubborn wound. Malchior reread the meters and found only honest shortages. Idaeus wiped his knife and looked at the sky the way a farmer reads weather. Riel stood apart, face tipped toward the sinking hulk, lips moving with a prayer that had no church. A whisper arrived through the vox, small as a splinter in the ear. My brother's voice, cracked to its childhood grain. Witness. Then numbers, coordinates that drew a clean descent from organ to horizon. A vector angling clear of the city if braced by fire at the right instant. I felt the old chalk bite my fingers, as if the law we drew on floors had remembered me. Satria saw the same geometry and did not blink. "He asks you to kill what remains of him," she said. "He asks me to let him choose how he ends," I answered, and the answer fit my mouth like an old coin. Verity smiled with learned pity that had purchased many verdicts. "Mercy becomes murder when written by family," she murmured, and the mirror shards caught her voice and made it smaller. Malchior's lids clicked toward casualty totals. In the quiet between numbers, I heard the mothers on the terraces practicing lullabies without promises. Idaeus said, "Aim for meaning," as if it were a mark painted on steel. Riel whispered that the litter of silk still carried engineers clinging to their doctrine like ropes. To save the ridge, we would hang them from our resolve. The vox returned, quieter. "Not slow," he said. "All at once. If the core reignites on impact, the year will fall here." I remembered the shard he had pressed into my glove. A child's compass etched in glass. A tool that preferred poverty to guesswork. I remembered the ribbon at my wrist and what it cost to knot it. "Open palinode," I said, and the ship answered with a hum like patience learning to hurry. Crews swung the guns toward the spire beneath which my brother stood, a narrow rib where an ending could be made precise. Satria's palm found my elbow. "If you hesitate, we will become the machine again," she warned, eyes bright as struck iron. Verity leaned forward, chains at her throat like borrowed scripture. "Or you could let it fall and teach them the price of courage," she suggested, and the word courage tried to wear a crown. The plaza breathed out in one long exhale. Even the ovens seemed to listen. Malchior read me a number I could live with, and one I could not. He set them on the rail like scales, and waited for gravity to choose. Idaeus asked only for a word that would make the young steady, and I understood the poverty of all words that come too late. Riel closed his eyes and named the engineers who could not hear him, as if names could soften velocity. I watched the cathedral groan, saw the fleet flinch, felt the air taste of iron and unmade oaths. Refugees on the terraces leaned forward with the terrible tenderness of witnesses who have run out of prayers. The mirrors lay in constellations underfoot. Faces broke into angles that refused to lie. A bell rang the wrong hour and was forgiven. Above us, the organ's veils tore on a crosswind. Below us, the river shrugged and kept moving toward the sea it had been promised as a child. I raised my hand to give the order, and the city tilted toward it, as if gravity had been waiting for my choice. I dropped my hand and Palinode spoke. A single thunder turned into instruction. The first shot kissed the rib below the spire, not to shatter, but to lean. Metal remembered weight, silk molted like weather, and the cathedral listed along the vector my brother had given. Satria's chains answered with a small bright rain. Malchior named the distance between forgiveness and aim. Idaeus steadied the young with a grunt that might have been prayer. Real whispered the engineers' names as if names could soften velocity. The second shot turned windows into snow. A hush trembled through the plazas, the kind mortals make when they choose not to look away. My brother's voice touched the vox once. Witness, thin as compass glass, then cut, and the fleet shifted, half rising, half remembering discipline, while I kept my hand down. Satria did not ask for mercy. She offered it to the living in loaves and steady eyes. The spire struck first, a neat bite in salt. Shock rolled the air flat. The Remembrance Corps, half-starved and half awake, tried to seize a last authority, flared, and died. For a blink the day went taller. Mirrors in the plaza leapt. Faces broke into constellations that refused crowns. The ovens held, the wells held. Something in the city exhaled a century. Then came the noise after the noise, the human part. Engineers still aboard fell in their litters and straps, and our oath keepers ran without orders. Idaeus dragged 3 from wreckage, while telling all of them not to thank him. Riol pulled a woman free by her belt, and learned he knew her name from a ledger he had once despised. Satria planted her chains as tripods so stretchers could stop pretending to be wings, and Malchior counted casualties aloud and let the number break his voice, then continued. From the dust a figure staggered, lit by the sour gleam of almost immortality. For a heartbeat I thought legend would try to live again. It was Verity Cord, cut loose in the tumult, smiling with teeth like withheld verdicts. "You have purchased ending," she said, accepting Idaeus's knife at her throat as accounting. "Your city will beg a clerk by winter." Satria eased the blade away, with a gentleness that dismissed prophecy. "The poor do not beg the bookkeeper," she said. "They teach hunger to keep records." I went among the fallen until the ribbon at my glove grew the colour of honest work. We found no body wearing my brother's crown, only a seam in the wreck where a man could step into anonymities, salt, smoke, rumour. He had held until it broke. He had given me a compass and an order. I obeyed. Now I kept witness. Mothers singing lullabies without lies, children learning to stack water, warriors learning to sit with their enemies and pass bread. Dusk came like a bruise cooling. Bells rang an hour we believed, and the fleet withdrew 1 ship's length, unsure whether vengeance remains noble when victory has learned modesty. Night settled without choosing a side, the wreck cooling to sculpture, while the fleet hovered like a law afraid of its own enforcement, and in the plazas people sorted shards into small constellations they could carry home, as if teaching their walls to remember light. A message arrived at third bell, spare as a coin. Deliver the regent at dawn, and the meridian sun would leave, and let mortality proceed unchaperoned. Satria read it twice, iron quiet against her skin. Idaeus rolled his shoulder until the scar remembered him. Malchior named the gambit by old words, decapitation masquerading as treaty, and set his abacus down as one sets aside an argument that has been heard and dismissed. Riol's mouth shaped no, then duty, then a path through the salt to a meeting ground that did not flatter ambush. Verity caught, wrist bound but gaze loosed, offered an invoice for my death, a schedule, witnesses, the price of spectacle discounted for immediacies. I walked the western balcony until stone learned my hesitation. Below, ovens breathed. Beyond, the wreck's ribs gleamed like wet bones in a surgeon's dream. The ribbon at my glove felt like a child tugging. The compass shard in my palm made poverty feel precise. When I turned, the council stood as if carved from a single quarried refusal. "The city will not buy tomorrow with you," Satria said, and for the first time her chains looked almost light. "Then let it buy tomorrow with the lesson," I answered. "If war must end, let it end with one decision that cannot be resurrected or negotiated." Idaeus swore softly, the farmer in him mourning his field. "We walk you out, we walk you back, or we do murder to the bargain." Malchior offered numbers that made none of us better. Real said he would guide because a map deserves to be used before it burns. Verity smiled like a ledger closing. "Every empire eventually hires an honest executioner," she said. An hour before dawn, we opened the gate, not as surrender, but as grammar, a sentence we would risk finishing. Refugees lined the canal with bowls held like lamps. Mothers sang lullabies without promises. The mirrors lay face up to accuse the sky. We stepped into the salt, Satria, Idaeus, Ryle, and I, with 12 oathkeepers moving as commas in a fragile paragraph. The meridian line waited beyond a seam of black glass, banners furled, guns in rest, a theatre allergic to applause. My brother was not there. Instead, a palanquin of pale wood, veiled, and the voice that had taught the organ to remember. "Regent," it said, gentle as a wire, "choose fidelity to your people and ascend." Satria's hand found my elbow. Idaeus's knife grew steadier. Ryle measured wind. I lifted the compass and felt it settle toward a point inside the veil. "I will ascend," I said, because the word meant climb and end, and we began to cross the seam. The fleet brightened like an idea hardening. We crossed the seam as if stepping onto the blade that had been waiting our whole lives. The palanquin's veil breathed with the fleet. Dust skittered across the black glass like letters learning to spell an ending. Satria to my left, Idaeus to my right, 12 oathkeepers punctuating our fear with discipline. Meridian ranks parted. A dais lowered, and a single stair unfolded. The word ascend made artifact. I turned the compass shard in my glove until it bit. It pointed not to stars, but to my ribs. "Hold the bridges thin," I said to Satria. She nodded, chains quiet, eyes iron turned kind. To Idaeus, I said, "If there is a speech, interrupt it with bread." He almost smiled. To Real, I gave the ribbon. "Tie this where the wind can misuse it." The veil rose. Not my brother. Only a clerk in pale silk, voice tuned to his cadence, merciful as measurement. "Regent," it said, "by your step, the meridian sun will lift and leave." Behind the silk geometry, the fleet brightened, rehearsing departure. I looked back once. The ridge watched with bowls and breath. Mirrors lay like constellations no priest could reorder. Ovens exhaled steadiness. I climbed. On the third stair, I felt the old flaw in my knee, a remembered campaign waking to object. I welcomed it. Suffering was the only oath that never lied. On the fifth stair, the clerk extended a ceremonial blade, slender enough to pass for quill. "Kneel," it said. I did, because kneeling, like standing, can be chosen. My throat found the old mathematics. I offered it my name. "Witness," I said. The blade pricked history and hesitated. Above us, the fleet shifted, torn between doctrine and relief. In that breath, a second veil tore. A figure stood revealed at the palanquin's heart, my brother without crown or choir, the tired geometry of a man who has held too much. He did not speak. He removed the blade from the clerk's hand and weighed it like a memory. His eyes found mine across the span we had ruined and saved. "Endings," I said. He nodded. "Endings." He set the blade aside. Silence moved through ranks, startled, then thinking. The clerk's mouth prepared a protest and found famine. Satria exhaled a prayer that had never needed a god. Idaeus broke a loaf and held it high. My brother turned, lifted his palms to his fleet, and made the oldest gesture a commander knows: stand down. Engines dimmed, banners furled. I rose, not forgiven, not condemned, mortal enough to carry the city home. We walked back over the black glass. The mirror shards did not cut, they counted. The people did not cheer, they breathed. The wreck settled, ribs cooling like a last sentence. The suns declined without theatre. In the observatory, later, I set the compass on stone and left it pointing at the place where a man had chosen to be less than an empire, and the city learned to live.